Hi everyone, it's Tracy, and in this 2021 theme tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this fun wood burn effect using Affinity Designer. Now I'm using the iPad version of the app. If you have the desktop version and you know where the tools are, the process is the same so you can easily follow along. Let's get started. Okay, I have a color palette that I'll be using for my illustration. You can use whatever color palette you'd like, but if you'd like to use the same as I am, I've included a link to it in the description below. You're going to need a password to access it, so I'll put it up on the screen right now. When you get to the downloads page, you'll see two different downloads, one for the color palette for the iPad and one for the desktop. The reason for this is that currently the iPad version has no way of directly importing an AF palette file into it, so you need to manually create your color palette by sampling colors. On the desktop version, you can just import the AF palette file I provided. There are two videos on the downloads page, one that shows you how to create the palette on the iPad version and one for the desktop version. The other thing that you'll see on the downloads page is a list of free font sites. Now, I'm going to be using a font for this particular tutorial, but you can do this effect on any shape that you create that's a curve, whether it's a font that's converted to a curve, your own lettering, or a shape that you create using the shape tool, pen, or pencil tools. The one thing I would recommend is that whatever you use has a nice amount of surface area so that you can really see the effect. So for example, this font that I've used, Sigmar 1, is nice and chunky, so there's a nice amount of space where you can really see the burn effect. When you get into tighter spaces, because of the shadowing, it's harder to see, but play around with different shapes and objects and see what works best for you. So let's go ahead and set up our canvas. Okay, I've created a new document and it's set at 10 by 10 inches and 300 dpi. That's just a preset I have in place. You can set yours to whatever size is suitable for you. Now just keep in mind, if you plan to print this, we are going to be using raster images, which means pixels are involved. Whenever that's the case, if you're going to print it, you want to make sure that your DPI is at least 300 and that you size your canvas to the largest size you plan to print. If you're only going to post this on the web, that doesn't matter as much, and the standard DPI for web is 72. So go ahead and set your canvas up to whatever size suits your needs. Now, I'm not going to worry about the background. We're going to add that last. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and create my plaque that the numbers are going to go on, and I'm going to create a rounded rectangle. Now, there isn't a baked-in rounded rectangle in the shape tool on the iPad, but there is on the desktop version. But it's really easy to create a rounded rectangle in iPad, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm not going to worry about the color I'm using because I'm actually going to have a texture overlay. I'm going to go to my rectangle tool, tap once, and then tap again. And I will go ahead and just drag out a rectangle. Now, right now, this is a shape. It's not a curve, which means I don't have any nodes to work with, and I need nodes to be able to round off my corners. So with this selected, I'm going to go to the bottom here, and where it says to curves, I'll just tap. Now, it doesn't look like anything happened, but what happened is it changed it from a rectangle to a curve, which means when I choose my corner tool, it's going to give me nodes to work with. Now, I should mention that my screen is flipped for a left-handed person, so our tools might be opposite of one another, but they work exactly the same. If you ever can't find a tool, just tap and hold on the question mark here, and you will get some nice labels. I'm going to go ahead to my corner tool here, and you can see that 4 nodes came up here. Now, if I were only changing one corner, I would just tap to select it and it'll turn blue, but I actually want all 4. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag out and select all 4 of them, and now all 4 are blue. And then I can just drag up on the radius in the contextual menu at the bottom and go to about 180. You can either drag or tap and key in a number. All right, I like how that looks, but right now it's a pretty flat square just sitting on my background. I want to add a little bit of life with some texture and other things. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my rectangle is centered on my canvas. I can kind of see that it's not. I'm going to turn my snapping on, which is this little magnet at the bottom. And with my move tool, I'll just drag this around until I see the vertical green line and the horizontal red line. That means it's dead center on my canvas. And I want to go ahead and add some wood texture to this. Now, The one thing I want to mention is we're going to be using texture image files for this. Whenever you're using images that are not your own, you want to make sure that you're using what are called free use images. What that means is the photographer who put them out there gives express permission for you to use them either as reference photos or as part of your design, but you have permission to do that. When you search Google, you're not necessarily finding a free use image and you could potentially be violating copyright. The cool thing about Designer is that the stock studio is directly linked to 3 of the top 3 free use image sites, Pexels, Pixabay, and Unsplash, so you know what you're using is allowable. So the stock studio is this little picture here. I'm going to go ahead and tap to select it. The first thing you'll see is this little terms of use thing. Just make sure you tap understand. And I'll just key in wood in the search. Now I know that the wood that I want to use here is in the Pexels, but I can tap back and forth between Unsplash, Pixabay, and Pexels, or I can tap on the name and it gives me a drop down. The wood I want to use for the top, for the surface, is going to be blemish free. I want it to be a solid piece of wood, so not planks, and I don't want it to have a lot of knots in it so that it doesn't pull away from the effect. I'm basically going to treat this as if I'm lasering or burning into a piece of composite wood. We're going to be using 2 different types of texture. The top is going to be that nice blemish-free texture, that nice blemish-free veneer. And the middle is going to be the core of the composite wood, which is typically a less expensive wood, so it has more grain and veins in it. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. And I'm going to use this kind of light-colored, very clean looking wood. I'll just tap and hold, and it's going to drop it right into my document. So again, really cool that you can just go right to those sites right from here. You don't have to back out and go to Safari. You can just go ahead and do it from here. I'm going to go ahead and size this up slightly. Now, right now it's sitting on top of my curve. I actually want it to be clipped within the bounds of my rounded rectangle. So I'm going to drag this layer down, and I want to stay to the right. The left is a different process. I want to see to the right of the layer, and you'll see the blue line in the middle of the curve layer. And once you do, just release. Sometimes it doesn't work, right? And now it's within the bounds of the curve. So you can see with this little arrow down, it's clipped to that curve layer. Now I can move this around. I can size up and size down till it's where I want it. I think it looks good right about there. Now, again, it's still a rather flat looking rectangle, even though it has texture on it. I need to add some shadow and highlight to give it a little bit more dimension. And we're going to do that using the FX Studio. I'm going to go ahead and select my curve and go to my FX Studio. Now, this studio will give you non-destructive edits that you can add to your object here. And the good thing about that is you can always go back in and make changes to it. They're non-destructive. And the reason I like using non-destructive edits is that way you don't have to go all the way back and start over again if you don't like how something looks. And inevitably, I find myself making changes as I go along. The first thing I want to do to this piece of wood is give it a drop shadow, so it looks like it's raised a little bit. So I'm going to go to outer shadow. I'm going to tap to toggle it on. And then I'll tap the name to give myself the contextual menu at the bottom. Let me close this so you can see better. Now I'm going to start just dragging around. You can see my shadow as I drag my pencil around. The first thing I'm going to do is determine which direction I want my light source. And the reason I do that is I'm going to be adding shadowing to a number of elements in here, and I want to make sure that all of them follow the same pattern. That way it looks cohesive and it doesn't look strange to the eye. So in this case, I want my light as if it's coming from this direction, which means my shadow will be down here at the bottom right. So I'm just going to move it around. I can also use offset to do the same thing. Now, right now you can see it's a really solid shadow. It doesn't look much like a shadow. I need to change my radius. That's going to blur it. I dragged it up to about 75, I think. And I'm going to change my intensity a little. Now I'm setting this now, but when I put the brick background at the very end, I may adjust this even more. But for right now, I'm actually just going to put this in place. I like how that's looking. I might move it in a little bit. It's a little too much shadow. Okay. Now that's great. It looks like it's a little bit raised, but I still want a little bit of highlight to give it a little bit more realistic look. I'm going to do that again with the FX Studio, so it's a non-destructive edit. So I'm going to make sure I have that selected. I'll go to my FX. You can see that the outer shadow is still on. Now I'm going to go to 3D, toggle it on, and tap. Now, if you notice when I turn this on and off, you can see it's adding a highlight there. I just mentioned that you want to make sure that your highlights and your shadows are following the direction of your light. If this were actually following my light coming from here, the highlight should be over here because my shadow is over here. So I need to move this highlight, and I can easily do that by going to the contextual menu at the bottom. I want to tap this arrow until I see the word azimuth. That's going to help me move my highlights, gradients, and things like that around. So if you watch this highlight as I drag up on this, you'll see it's moving. Might be a little bit difficult to see against the white background. Let me go back to the front here. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So you can see right there, if I zoom in, it's at the top corner here. I'm just going to soften it up a bit. All right. Let's back out of that. So I like that. I like how the highlight is here at the top corner. My shadow is down here. For now, this looks good. Again, I might adjust it later once I add my background in, but I'm going to keep this as is. But it has some nice life to it. It looks like it's a thicker piece of wood. Now I want to go ahead and add my numbering to it. So we're going to go ahead and do that using a font. Okay, I'm going to go to my text tool and choose artistic text tool and start dragging out. Now I've done this a couple of times, so it's automatically picking up the font that I want to use, Sigmar 1. But again, you can go ahead and use any font you'd like, or you can use your own lettering. I just want to go ahead and type in, let's see if it'll give me the typewriter here. I'm going to type in 2021. And I like to use the move tool to size up and size down my numbering or lettering. I just find it easier than using the text studio. I'm also going to drag this so that I know it's dead center. I want to make these a little bit taller. So just size it however you'd like. Again, I'm using a font here that has a nice amount of surface area, but go ahead and play around with whatever one you'd like. Now, because this is a font, I can't individually work with each one. It's considered one large piece. And if you look at the layer studio, you can see it's art text. I want to be able to individually manipulate each of these numbers. So to do that, I need to convert this from art text to a curve. So with it selected, I'll go up to the edit menu and I'm going to tap convert to curves, and you can see that it's changed this to a group. And if I open that group, I have individual numbers. So now I can work with each one individually. The first thing I want to do is add a wood grain to each of these numbers. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to treat this as if it's a composite piece of wood, so we have a nice veneer on the top and a less expensive piece of wood on the inside. So I want to find a piece of texture that has a little bit more veins, a little more grain to it. So I'll go back to my stock studio, and I know the one I want is in here. I'm going to pick this one. It's pretty close to this color, but it's a little bit darker and again, a little bit more veiny. So I'm going to tap and hold, and it's going to bring it into my document. So I'm going to place a single image file on each number. I'm going to start with the 1. I just want to size this down a little bit. I want to clip this to the 1. So I'm going to drag it down like we did with the rectangle, stay to the right. And as long as you see that line in the middle of the layer, when you release, it clips it to the 1. Now it's a little too light. It looks kind of like it's lightly stained. I want to change the blend mode of this to have the texture come through, but darken it up a little bit. So I'll go to my layers option, tap, and choose multiply. And that's going to darken it a little bit. Now I need to duplicate this texture image file 3 times because I want to add it to the other 3 numbers. Because again, these are all separate, which means I can't just scroll across all the other 3. I need to individually add it. So I'm going to go back to my layer studio, and with that image selected, I'll go to my edit menu and tap duplicate 3 times. So that gives me 4 separate image files for each number. And you can see it darkened up because I had this set to multiply, which means you're still seeing the texture, but it's going to add levels of darkness with each layer. As we move them to each of the numbers, you'll see that lighten. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this down and clip it to the 2 and just grab the texture. I'm going to move it over. I don't want the texture to be exactly the same as the one next to it because I want it to look a little bit different. Now, because I already had this set to multiply when I duplicated it, I don't need to do it with each individual one. I'm going to go ahead and drag this down to the 0. And again, I'll grab it move it over. I think I'm going to flip this one. I want the grain to go the same way, but I'm going to flip it so that the texture is not exactly the same. And then I'll do the last two. And again, drag it. Oop, I got to go back and drag it. Drag it over. And I'm just going to place it so it's a little different than the other three. Okay, so we have our texture in place, but again, it looks kind of like we just stained the numbers onto the wood. And I want this to look like it was burned in. So in addition to the wood, we need to add some effects to these. And we're going to go back to our FX Studio to do that. Okay, so the cool thing about Designer is that I can add effects to one. And if I want to apply the same effects to my other numbers that are exactly the same as the one, I can just copy it and paste it across. I don't need to go into each individual one unless I want different effects for each one. So I'm gonna go ahead and with my one selected, I'll go to my FX Studio, and the first thing I want to add is an inner shadow. So I want it to have an appearance of depth as if we're burning down into the wood. So I'm going to turn on inner shadow and then tap to get the contextual menu. Now, the color that's coming up automatically is black, and that's not going to look as natural as if we chose a brown color from within this number. So I'm going to tap on color, and I want to select this little eyedropper tool. I'm going to drag across, and you can see a little square in the middle of my magnifying glass there, and the outer ring is going to change to the color that I've selected in that little square. I want to find a darker brown, so it's not going to be black, but it is going to be dark. Sometimes it's a little difficult. There we go. Oh, still didn't get it. All right, let's try that one more time. There we go. So now I have a darker, almost maroony brown. That's going to look a lot more natural as a burn than black would. I'm going to keep my blend mode at multiply because that's the standard blend mode for shadows and it'll work perfectly. But I want to start playing with my radius and stuff because you can't really see anything at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring my radius up probably to about, I would say 75. And I want to bring my offset up so that you can start seeing it in there. Let's see. So you can see these shadows coming in. So it's giving it the appearance of depth as if we're burning down. And I'm going to bring my intensity up a little bit. I'd say to about 30. All right. I'm going to just bring my offset down just a little bit. All right. So I don't want it to look as if it's down an inch or two. I want it to be a very shallow burn, but I still want enough where there's a shadow. Now, an additional thing that I want to add is a glow around the edge of the entire thing. If I show you something that I've lasered here, you can see that it's darker around the entire edge. So I want to give the appearance of that when I'm burning this one. So I'm going to use inner glow for that. Within the same panel, because I'm applying multiple effects to one number here, I'm going to turn on inner glow, tap to get the contextual menu. Now, right now the color is white. I actually want a dark brown color again. So I'm going to tap the color, grab my eyedropper tool, and I just want to find a dark brown again. There we go. I'll just make that a little bit darker using the handle here. All right, I'm going to start bringing my radius up and you'll start seeing a glow around the entire edge. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to make sure that my blend mode is multiply. I don't want screen because again, we're trying to get more of a shadow here. So bring the radius in. I'm going to bring the intensity down. I don't want it to be too much. I just want it to have a subtle glow around the entire edge. And we'll bring our opacity down slightly. All right, so now that gives more of an impression of depth. We have more shadowing over here because our light source is coming from here, but we have a little bit here. Now, the other thing that I want to make sure is that I have a little bit of a burn on the outside. So this is the last effect we're going to add. Now, if I burn something on my laser, you can see that wherever I cut or burn, I get this little char on the edge. Now, I have this mask, so if I pull this masking tape off, you won't see it on the wood, and you can sand it off as well. But I'm going to keep it on here because it adds to the effect. I'm going to do that with outer glow. So I'm going to turn on outer glow. Again, these are all non-destructive, so if you don't like how something looks, you can always go back in and change it. I'm going to tap to get the contextual menu. And this time I want to sample something from in here because it's going to be laying on the top of this. So I'm going to tap my color and I'm just going to randomly select something. So it's not white, it's just slightly beige, and that's perfect. I'll go to my blend mode and I'm going to change it to color burn. Now you can't see anything yet because we haven't changed the radius, but as I drag up on that, you'll start to see that bloom out from the edge. And you can change the intensity. You can also darken the color, change the opacity. I like how that looks. I might change the radius just a little bit. Just bring it up. Sometimes I go a little more than I need to just to really drive it home, but I like how that's looking. So right now it looks like it's burned down and it has a little char on the edge. So I want to apply these 3 effects to these 3 numbers without having to go into the other 3 numbers and doing each one individually. Well, I can just go to my layers, make sure that that one is selected, go to my edit menu, tap copy. Then I'm going to go back to my Layer Studio, tap on the 2, and then swipe across on the other 2 numbers. You want to make sure that you've selected the curve layer. And then I'm going to go back to my edit menu and tap paste FX. And that's going to add the effect to the rest of the numbers. So you can go back into each of these individual ones if you want to make them a little bit different, change, say, the radius on one so it looks like it was a little bit more burned. It's totally up to you. But because each one has its own individual effect on it, you can easily do that. So the next thing I want to do is go ahead and add my little bolts on the 4 sides. Okay, so I'm going to create mine with an ellipse. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, select ellipse, and I want to select my lighter kind of putty color here. And I'm just going to create one and then duplicate it. I'm going to drag out my ellipse. I'm going to hold my finger down so I get a perfect circle. I don't want it to be too big because I don't want it to distract, but I don't want it to be so small you can't see it. So I'm going to do about 700 by 700 inches. And just drag this to where I want it. When you have snapping on, it'll give you guides as to where you have it so I can see that it's lined up with this too. Now I want to add some rust texture to this. So we're going to have some rusty nails. I also want this to look like it's not an embedded screw, that it's sitting on top of the wood. So we're going to add an effect to that to get that look. The first thing I'll do is go ahead and add the rust. So I'm going to go back to my stock studio. I'm going to type in rust for my search. And I know the one that I want is in Pixabay, so I'll just tap across here. I like this particular one because it has a lot of variation in it. And what I want to do eventually is change the rust location on each of the nails because the chances of having them exactly the same is pretty slim. So I'm just going to go ahead and place this, and then we'll drag it down and clip it. Now, right now, that just looks like a rusty dot sitting on the top of the panel. It doesn't have any sort of life to it. We want to add a little bit more depth to it. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure the ellipse is selected, go to the FX panel, and in this case, I want to turn on bevel and emboss. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle that on and then tap. I'm going to go to the type at the bottom. If I leave it as a pillow, it kind of looks like it's embedded into the wood, and I don't want that. I actually want emboss. So I'm going to tap and then select emboss. It gives me a nice highlight here and a shadow there, and it's following along nicely, so I don't need to change the direction. If I did, you can use the azimuth to change it, but it's actually fine. I might soften it up a little bit though, and I think I'm going to change the opacity of the shadow. So I've scrolled across on the contextual menu. I'm going to drag that up, and I might knock the highlight down a little bit because we're going to add the 3D effect too. So I don't need this highlight to be as big. Okay, so that looks good, but I want to add a little bit more to it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on 3D, tap to select the contextual menu. Now it's added my highlight over here, so I need to move it to over here. So I'm going to go ahead and tap across again until I get azimuth, and then just going to drag until my highlight is where I want it. So I kind of want it in line with the highlight on the panel. All right. Now if I zoom out, all right, I like how that looks. The only thing I need to add now is the little X for the screw. So we're going to make this like it's a Phillips head screw. I'm going to select my darker color here, and I'm going to go back to my rectangle tool and select the square star. I'm going to drag one out. Now this is giving me 5 sections, and I only need 4. I'm holding my finger down so I get a nice shape. I'm going to go to the bottom and tap 4 to get 4 sides. Now, as long as you're working with a shape and you have the shape tool selected, on certain shapes, you'll get these little red dots that you can use to make further edits. I'm going to use that to sort of make this a little bit smaller. Sometimes it's a little touchy. You can also use the drag up and drag down here. All right. Now I'm going to use my move tool and just decrease the sizes. I'm holding my finger down just to keep the dimensions proportion. And I'm placing that in the center of the screw. Now, I'm not going to add an effect to this, but I am going to change the blend mode because it's so small, and when it's zoomed out, you're not really going to see anything. The only thing I'm going to do is go ahead and change this to multiply. So I've gone into the layer option and just changed the blend mode. So you can see if I zoom in here, the texture's coming through, but any effect I add to it is really not going to have much impact on this. So I'm just going to leave that as is. I am going to go ahead and clip this to my lips just so that they stay together. Now I can use this to duplicate and create the other three. I'm going to start with the right side. I'm going to go ahead and go to my edit menu and duplicate. With my move tool selected and my finger down on the canvas, I'm going to drag across, and you can see that it's staying in line with it because as long as I have my finger down, it's going to keep it in line. Oh, somehow I managed to just duplicate the star. Let's go ahead and back. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I have the ellipse selected and then duplicate it. Mistakes, they do happen. I'm going to go ahead with my move tool and just drag across. And again, because I have my finger down, it's keeping it in line. And that's right where I want it. I'm going to select the two of them, so I have both ellipses selected. Hit duplicate, and now I'm going to drag these down with my finger down on the canvas. And I kind of moved it out of place, but you can see the green line on the right side is lining up. And I just want to move it there. All right. And you can move them individually too if you want, just tap into them. Now the final thing I want to do with these screws is, again, the chances of them all having the same rust pattern are pretty slim. So I want to make some little changes to these just to give it a little bit more realism. I'm going to go into the texture and I'm going to move the texture around so that I have a different spot. I'm also going to tap on the ellipse and just kind of rotate it because the chances that I screwed this into place exactly the same on each one is pretty slim as well. So I'll just do 3 of these. I don't need to do all of them because the first one is what it is. And again, I'll just rotate this slightly and do the third one here. All right. Okay, so our 4 screws are done. The final thing we need to do is add our background, and we're going to go back to the stock studio to do that. Okay, I'm going to use a brick background. You can use any background you'd like, wood, you can have it on whatever you'd like, metal. I'm going to type in brick, and I want something that has sort of a close-up feel because this is a zoomed in picture of this plaque. So I'm just going to go ahead and find, I like this kind of neutral brick. So I'm going to go ahead and tap and hold it and then let it download. Now, right now it's sitting on top of the entire thing. I'm going to go ahead and group these together. I want to group the entire plaque together. So I'm tapping on the bottom curve and then I'm 2-finger tapping. Oh, let's try that again. Tapping on the bottom curve and then 2-finger tapping on the top ellipse so that all of the objects that make up the sign, and then I'm going to hit group. And now I can move the brick below the whole plaque. And then I'll just go ahead and place it where I want. And let's make this a little bit bigger. All right. And the great thing about using these is you can move it around. If you don't like where it's at, you can size it up. Don't size up too much because, again, you'll run into muddiness, but these are really high resolution photos that are coming from these sites, so you're starting off with good files. Okay, so that's it. So with a mix of effects, blend modes, and texture image files, you can create this fun wood burn effect. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I would love it if you would give it a thumbs up. I will be doing other tutorials on various apps from the rest of the Affinity suite, as well as the Adobe products and Procreate. So if you want to be notified whenever I post a tutorial, just hit subscribe and hit notifications and you'll always know when I post something. As always, I have my full classes on my Skillshare channel and the link to that is in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'm wishing all of you a very happy, healthy, and safe New Year.